A cowboy saved a black woman from a whipping. The next day, she came to his cabin to pay him back. But what she offered would change everything. "Untie her," the giant cowboy commanded, his voice cutting through the jeering crowd as the trembling woman stood bound to the whipping post. The townspeople saw her as nothing but a thief who deserved every lash. They figured she'd be broken and driven out by sunset, but the weathered drifter who stepped between her and the mob carried his own burden of guilt, seeking a redemption he didn't think he deserved. What neither the cowboy nor the vengeful crowd knew was that this educated woman possessed something worth killing for. Legal papers hidden in her torn dress. Papers that could expose a conspiracy reaching far beyond their dusty frontier town. When she returns to his cabin, will her dangerous secret destroy them both? Or will it finally deliver the justice they've both been denied? The autumn wind carried dust through the streets of Cedar Ridge. Sarah Collins hurried between the scattered buildings on the edge of town, a small bundle of bread clutched against her chest. She ducked into an abandoned barn. Inside, three young faces looked up at her, their eyes wide with hunger and anticipation. She had been teaching them in secret for weeks, knowing their families couldn't afford a proper school. She broke the bread and handed each child a piece. Their grateful smiles made the risk worthwhile. She had used her last coins at Bradley's Mercantile, but the single loaf wasn't enough for her and the children. Suddenly, the barn door burst open with a violent crash. The store owner, Bradley, stood there, his face twisted with rage. Two men flanked him, their hands resting on their gun belts. "There she is," Bradley snarled, "caught red-handed with my stolen bread." The children scrambled backward in terror. Sarah stepped in front of them, her chin raised. "I paid for that bread." But her words were lost as Bradley's men grabbed her, their rough hands tearing the fabric of her dress as they dragged her into the street. The crowd that gathered was a mix of curiosity and cruelty. The whipping post stood waiting in the center of the town square, its wood scarred from years of use. Bradley's men bound Sarah's wrists above her head, the rough rope cutting into her skin. Sheriff Hawkins emerged from his office, his face showing neither concern nor authority. "What's the charge?" he asked, his voice flat. "Theft," Bradley announced to the growing crowd. He retrieved a leather whip from the sheriff's office and tested it with a sharp crack against the ground. The crowd murmured its approval. From the shadows between the livery stable and the saloon, a tall figure emerged. Jack Morrison moved with the measured pace of a man who had seen too much violence. His trail coat was dusty, his hat brim casting deep shadows across his weathered face. He'd only arrived in Cedar Ridge that morning to resupply before winter closed the mountain passes. The sight of the bound woman stopped him cold. Memories of another time, another place, another moment when he had failed to act, flooded back. He crossed the street, the crowd parting slightly as he approached. They sensed something dangerous in his calm. "Untie her," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the square like a judgment. Bradley turned, the whip still in his hand. "This ain't your concern, stranger." Jack's hand moved to rest on the rifle slung across his back. "I'm making it my concern." Bradley hesitated. Jack wasn't just a drifter. There was something in his eyes, a stillness that promised violence. The crowd grew nervous. Jack stepped to the post and began working at the ropes. "You're making a mistake," Bradley warned. "She's a thief." Sarah's hands came free. She stumbled as circulation returned to her arms. Jack steadied her, then shrugged out of his trail coat and draped it over her shoulders. The heavy fabric swallowed her small frame, offering both warmth and dignity. Without another word, Jack guided her away from the post. The crowd watched in stunned silence as they walked toward the edge of town, where Jack's horse waited beneath the cottonwoods. Jack's cabin was sparse but clean, a single room with a stone fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah sank into a chair by the hearth, exhaustion finally taking hold. Jack moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, setting a pot of beans to warm. He placed a tin cup of water in front of her without a word. "Thank you," she said, her voice a whisper. He just nodded. He didn't ask questions, and his silence was a strange comfort. They ate the simple meal of beans and bread. When they were done, he gestured to the single bed. "You take the bed, I'll take the floor." He banked the fire and blew out the lamp, leaving only the glow of embers. Soon his breathing settled into sleep, but Sarah remained awake. Her hand moved to a hidden pocket in her dress, feeling for the papers that represented everything. The documents were still safe, but for how long? Morning came gray and cold. "I should go," she said, though the words felt hollow. "Where?" Jack asked. The simple question hung in the air. She had no answer. "Then stay," he said, "until you figure it out." She spent the day helping with chores, transforming the chaotic cabin into something resembling order. Jack watched her, his suspicion growing. Her speech, her posture, the way she worked, it all spoke of a life far different from that of a common thief. That night, she told him, she spread her father's legal documents across the kitchen table. Deeds, bank statements, correspondence. "My father was Samuel Collins," she began. "He was a free man who came west with nothing. He worked every job he could and saved every penny." Jack studied the papers, legal documents, property deeds, territorial seals. "He bought land," Sarah continued, 200 acres of the best farmland in the territory. It borders your property to the south. Jack's eyes widened. He knew that land. Rich soil, good water. It was worth a fortune. "He left it all to me when he died last year," she said. "Every acre." The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. This wasn't about stolen bread. This was about land worth killing for. "Bradley knows," Jack said. Sarah nodded. "He's been trying to force me out since the day I arrived. When threats didn't work, he started spreading lies. The children I was teaching, that gave him the excuse he needed." Jack looked at the woman before him with new understanding. She wasn't a victim seeking charity. She was a landowner fighting for what was hers. "We need to get you to the territorial capital," he said. "File these papers properly." "I tried," she said. "Bradley has friends there. The clerk told me the documents were forgeries." The corruption ran deeper than he thought. But as he looked at her, he saw a fire in her eyes that wouldn't be extinguished. She wasn't going to run, and she wasn't going to surrender. "Then we fight him here," Jack said. Sarah spread her father's documents across the kitchen table. The records went back 15 years, a meticulous history of every purchase, every payment. But as Jack studied them, he saw a pattern, a familiar, ugly pattern. It wasn't just Bradley. There were other names, other towns, other properties. "What about the territorial authorities?" he asked. "I wrote to them 3 times," Sarah said, showing him the official letters. Each one found a technical objection, a bureaucratic reason to deny her claim. "You need someone they can't ignore," Jack said. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of letters tied with string. "I've been corresponding with other teachers," she said. "Women like me who've lost their positions or face similar problems with land claims." Jack read the letters. The pattern became chillingly clear. Teacher after teacher describing property disputes, legal challenges, and pressure from local businessmen. It wasn't just Sarah. It was a network, a conspiracy. "It's bigger than Bradley," Sarah said. "It's a web of men using legal intimidation and bureaucratic delays to steal property from people who can't fight back." She pulled out a detailed map she had drawn, marking each location. The red marks spread across 3 territories. Jack felt a cold anger rise in him. He had served briefly as a territorial deputy years ago, before tragedy drove him into isolation. He knew how these schemes worked. "If this crosses territorial boundaries," he said, "it becomes a federal matter." Sarah's eyes brightened. "But how do we reach them?" Jack went to a wooden box beneath his bed. Inside were letters and documents from his past life, including correspondence with federal marshals he had worked with. One name stood out. "Marshal Elena Vasquez," he said. "She's a federal investigator. She'll take this seriously." That evening, Deputy Williams rode up to the cabin. "Sheriff wants to know if you're harboring a fugitive," he called out. "No fugitive here," Jack replied. "Just a woman whose rights were violated." "Bradley's pressing charges," Williams said, his voice low. "Theft, assault. If she doesn't show for trial, there'll be a warrant." After he left, Sarah sat with her head in her hands. "They're going to take it all." "Not if we get to Marshal Vasquez first," Jack said, his voice grim. The next morning, two more women appeared at the cabin door. Their faces showed the same mix of fear and determination Jack had seen in Sarah. "We heard what happened," one of them said. "We've had similar troubles." Soon the cabin became an impromptu war room. Women from across the region arrived, bringing documents, stories, and evidence. The conspiracy was bigger, more organized than any of them had imagined. Sarah worked by lamplight, her correspondence network now stretching across 3 territories, connecting teachers, property owners, and legal advocates. "We need more time," she told Jack as another rejection letter arrived. Then a well-dressed man in an expensive suit rode up with 2 armed escorts. A corrupt territorial judge named Harrison Morrison. "I understand you've been harboring a fugitive," he said with a false warm smile. He had come to serve Sarah with a formal notice to appear in his court. He dismissed her evidence with a condescending laugh. "He's been bought," Sarah said after he left. "Everything about him screams corruption." That night she began writing furiously. Letter after letter, calling in every favor, every connection. The first response came before dawn. A telegram. Federal Marshal Elena Vasquez would arrive in Cedar Ridge tomorrow, with federal warrants. Sarah had gone over their heads. Her father's old business partner, now a railroad commissioner, had forwarded her evidence straight to the federal authorities. When Marshal Vasquez arrived with 2 deputies, Jack recognized her immediately. She was still tall, still imposing, with the quiet authority that had made her a legend. "Jack Morrison," she said with a slight smile, "I should have known you'd be involved in something like this." She turned to Sarah. "Miss Collins, your evidence was very thorough. We've already verified the interstate connections. This is now a federal investigation." Judge Morrison arrived an hour later with Bradley and several armed men. His confident demeanor evaporated when he saw the federal marshals. "This is a territorial matter," he protested. "Not anymore," Vasquez said, her federal badge clearly visible. "This is an investigation into interstate fraud and conspiracy. You're all under investigation. Anyone attempting to interfere will face additional charges." Bradley's face went pale. Judge Morrison shifted nervously. Their scheme had been exposed at a level they couldn't control. The federal hearing convened in the town square, the same place Sarah had nearly been whipped. Under canvas tents, Marshal Vasquez called the proceedings to order. Sarah was the first to testify. She presented her father's documents, then her own meticulous records of the conspiracy. She spoke with the calm authority of a woman who knew she had the truth on her side. The prosecutor then called the other victims. Woman after woman told a similar story of legal harassment and property theft. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. Bradley's defense crumbled. He couldn't explain the systematic nature of the fraud. Judge Morrison's claims of ignorance were shattered by federal bank records showing payments from Bradley. Even Sheriff Hawkins, shamed into honesty, testified for the prosecution, admitting he had been pressured to ignore the women's complaints. When Marshal Vasquez returned with her verdict, the square fell silent. "The evidence clearly establishes systematic fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations," she announced. "Federal warrants are hereby issued for the arrest of Bradley, Judge Harrison Morrison, and their co-conspirators." The crowd erupted. Federal deputies moved in, arresting the men who had seemed so powerful just hours before. Sarah's property rights were officially restored. The federal government ordered the immediate return of all illegally seized properties. As the proceedings concluded, townspeople approached Sarah to offer apologies. Those who had jeered at the whipping post now sought her forgiveness. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the porch of her newly built schoolhouse. It sat on a gentle rise overlooking her restored property, its windows catching the early morning light. 23 students, including Judge Morrison's children, filed inside. Jack approached from the barn, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. His partnership with Sarah had evolved into something deeper than either had expected. Then a wagon approached. It was Marshal Vasquez again. "Miss Collins," she said, "I'm here with an offer." She handed Sarah an official document. The Territorial Education Commission was offering her the position of regional school supervisor. It would make her responsible for establishing schools across 3 territories, with full federal backing. It was an opportunity beyond anything she could have imagined, but it would mean leaving Cedar Ridge, leaving everything she and Jack had built. Jack read the document over her shoulder, his face unreadable. That night they talked. "It's a good opportunity," he said. It would mean leaving, she said. You could help hundreds of children instead of dozens, he replied. This is my home, she said, looking out at the land her father had loved, at the school she had built from the ashes of injustice. My work is here. She refused the federal position. Instead, she announced plans to expand her school into a full academy, a beacon of education and justice for the entire region. Jack would oversee the agricultural program while she developed curricula in law, business, and civic leadership. On Christmas Eve, as they stood in the completed academy chapel, Jack proposed. Will you marry me, he asked, and help me be worthy of what we've created here? Her answer was simple and profound. Yes, because together, we can do more than either of us could accomplish alone. Their wedding took place in the schoolhouse the following spring. Marshall Vasquez was her witness. The ceremony symbolized not just their union, but the transformation of an entire community. Where hatred and corruption had once flourished, education and justice now provided hope for future generations. 5 years later, the Cedar Ridge Academy was the most respected educational institution in the territory. Sarah's story inspired others to stand firm in the pursuit of justice. Cedar Ridge had been reborn. If you believe that one person's courage can change the world, and that justice is always worth fighting for, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming next.